The San Jacinto campaign, the final chapter of the Texas Revolution, began on March 13th, when General Houston received the news that the Alamo had fallen. He had a small army, he had about 400 men at that point, were on their way to the Alamo to reinforce Travis's men, but they'd only made it as far as Gonzales before they learned that they were too late. Realizing that he was vastly outnumbered, Houston immediately ordered his men to start retreating east, and to burn the town of Gonzales before they left. He didn't want to leave potential supplies to the Mexican army to use when they came through. The terrified and now homeless citizens of Gonzales accompanied the army, and more civilians joined as they moved further and further east. So for a lot of their retreat eastwards, the army was acting also as a guard for the runaway scrape.
After a lengthy retreat, the Texian army made its way to Groce's Landing on March 31st of 1836. They spent the time there productively. The Texian army got what was probably the first professional training they had done as far as drilling, marching, skills of that nature. While they were waiting, they did by April 12th finally get 2 cannons called the Twin Sisters that had been donated by Cincinnati, Ohio. These cannons are named after the daughters of Dr. C.C. Rice, who was on the ship that brought them to the Texian army. The 2 daughters had presented the cannons when they landed, and so in honor of them, they named the cannons after the 2 little girls.
After leaving Groce's plantation and heading east, it could be said that this was probably the darkest time for the Texas Army. The Alamo had fallen. Defeat was all around them. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what they were going to do. And a lot of the men felt that Sam Houston was just going to run away from the battle. In fact, on the road from Groce's plantation to the crossroads where that decision had to be made, there were as many as 50 men that deserted. Sam Houston had held his cards very close to his vest and not revealed what he was going to do. When Sam Houston and his army, a ragtag mix of both regulars and volunteers, arrived at the crossroads, a decision was to be made. Would they engage Santa Anna in battle and head toward Harrisburg, or would they flee toward the United States and head toward Nacogdoches? Ultimately, Sam Houston and his army made the decision to head toward Harrisburg and imminent battle with Santa Anna. Houston had the advantage of many spies. Many of his men knew the terrain, knew the area, and they had done excellent work in capturing correspondence Santa Anna was sending to various aspects of his army. With that intelligence, Sam Houston and his army were able to make the decision to head toward Harrisburg. They knew Santa Anna would be there. Sam Houston ultimately knew that this could be his Waterloo.
As Houston and the Texian army retreated, Santa Anna and the Mexican army advanced eastward. They captured Thompson's Ferry near modern-day Sugar Land, and by April 14th, the Mexican army had crossed the Brazos River. However, instead of waiting for his army to regroup after the crossing, Santa Anna took a small vanguard, about 750 to 800 men, and headed directly to Harrisburg, where he knew that the Texian government was stationed. When President Burnett and the rest of the Texian cabinet learned that the Mexican army had crossed the Brazos River and was headed straight towards them, they decided to abandon the city and flee to Galveston for the remainder of the war. In fact, they left Harrisburg just hours before Santa Anna and his troops arrived. A furious Santa Anna ordered his men to burn Harrisburg and sent 50 men under Colonel Juan Almonte to continue chasing President Burnett. Almonte caught up with Burnett, Vice President Lorenzo de Zavala, and their families at the town of New Washington, which is roughly modern-day LaPorte, where they were waiting to get on a boat to take them to Galveston. I mean, they were literally standing at the edge of the water as the schooner was being loaded when a messenger came rushing up shouting, "Make haste, Mr. President, the Mexicans are coming." It's the Texas Revolution's own Paul Revere moment. Burnett, de Zavala, their families leapt into a boat and pushed off from shore, but they were only 30 or 40 yards away from the beach when Almonte's troops arrived, dismounted, and took aim. However, Almonte realized that Hannah Burnett, President Burnett's wife, was in the boat with her family, and unwilling to potentially risk killing a woman, he ordered his men to hold their fire. Burnett, de Zavala, and the rest of the cabinet was able to make it to Galveston. When Santa Anna and his remaining men reached Almonte in New Washington on April 18th, he was predictably furious, but at that point it was too late.
The Battle of San Jacinto took place on a peninsula between the San Jacinto River and Buffalo Bayou, what was all part of the McCormick family's land. The Texian army made its way to this land by April 20th. The Mexican army made its way from New Washington and was before the Texian army by 11:30 a.m. They set up their camp on a hill just a small ways away from the wooded area that the Texian army was taking cover in. When these two sides noticed each other, they started an artillery skirmish. The twin sister cannons were firing, and the Mexican army, they had one cannon called the Golden Standard, or El Volcán, which accounts vary, but it was probably a 9 or a 12-pound cannon, so a little bit bigger than the twin sisters. And so they're shooting these volleys of grape shot back and forth until about 3 p.m. that day. And they draw back to their camps. The Mexican army decided they were a little too close for comfort, so they started pulling their camp back towards the ridgeline. They managed to move the ammunition for the cannon, but the cannon took a little bit longer.
On the morning of April 21st, when Koss and his reinforcements arrived, the numbers were no longer in favor of the Texan army. Houston, throughout the day of April 21st, discussed with his leadership what they should do, when they should attack. But as Houston did throughout the campaign, he was not very forthcoming in what his plan was. For the Texan camp, battle must be imminent. The Texans were not there to negotiate. They were not there to surrender. They were there to fight or die. Sam Houston sent his most trusted spy, Deaf Smith, to destroy the bridge at Vince's Bayou. This eliminated any real easy way to retreat, encircling the peninsula with water on all sides.
By about 3:30 p.m., the order was given to line up and make ready for an attack. One of the Texian soldiers later wrote that, quote, "The announcement of the decision to fight acted like electricity. The Texian soldiers lined up in a low area right before the ridge, and they started advancing from the west towards the Mexican camp. They marched through a tall grass prairie. Imagine a sea of grass surrounding them. The Texian army got close to the Mexican camp, within about 50 to 75 yards, according to accounts, before they attacked. The Mexican camp was not ready for this attack. In fact, by about noon that day, Santa Anna had taken his sentries off the ridge. The first troops to draw blood were on the far side near the marsh, under Colonel Sidney Sherman. They attacked the reinforcements General Koss had brought that morning. The Mexican troops did not have much motivation to be there to begin with, and they very quickly ran into the middle of the camp, causing chaos. Meanwhile, the Golden Standard was firing towards the opposite side of the Texian army at the cavalry. Houston was in the middle of the line along with the Twin Sisters. The Twin Sisters stopped about 200 yards away on the ridge and started firing down on the Mexican camp. Chaos quickly ensued. The Mexican troops, especially the Preferencia, the battle-hardened veterans, tried to mount a counterattack. They were not successful, but they fought back for several minutes before the camp was overrun by Texian soldiers shouting, "Remember the Alamo! Remember La Bahia!"
The actual Battle of San Jacinto is often referred to as 18 minutes of glory. While true, the battle was decisively won in those 18 minutes, the carnage continued far past. In fact, it went into the early evening, to the point where Sam Houston conceded he had no control over the slaughter his men were executing. San Jacinto is arguably one of the most decisive victories ever won. While the two sides were fairly equally matched, the loss of life on one side versus the loss of life on another side was astronomical. Sam Houston reports that 620 Mexican soldiers laid dead on the grounds of San Jacinto. In comparison, the Texas Army lost 9 men.
The Texian army decisively won the Battle of San Jacinto, but they failed to capture Santa Anna. He had fled the Mexican camp during the battle, hoping he could rejoin the rest of his troops, which were still stationed on the Brazos River. However, Houston's decision to destroy Vince's Bridge paid off. Santa Anna was captured the next day by Texian scouts trying to cross Vince's Bayou. Texian scouts originally didn't realize who they had captured, but when they brought him into the Texian camp, the Mexican soldiers who had been taken prisoner the day before started shouting his name. The Texian soldiers initially wanted to kill him right then and there, but General Houston ordered them to stand down, and seated under a live oak on the edge of the Buffalo Bayou, the two generals hashed out a ceasefire. In exchange for his life, Santa Anna immediately wrote letters to his remaining generals ordering them to take the rest of the troops out of Texas and retreat south of the Rio Grande. Well, the Texas Revolution wasn't officially over until the treaties of Alaska were signed on May 14th. The war was essentially over right here at San Jacinto, the birthplace of Texas, on April 22, 1836.